Everyone, just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 1 minute. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Fall Prevention, Best Practices for the Three Main Types of Hazards, sponsored by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor at Safety and Health, and I'm moderating today's event. Thank you so much for joining us, and before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may also receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speakers. With us today are Mark Stromey and Edwin Zaleski. Mark is a senior editor with J.J. Keller and develops content for various J.J. Keller publications specializing in OSHA construction and general industry regulations. Mark is also an authorized OSHA outreach construction trainer and a walkway auditor certificate holder. His areas of expertise include workplace violence, electrical safety, fall protection, forklift compliance, walking working surfaces, and aerial and scissor lifts. Edwin is also a senior editor at J.J. Keller. Edwin researches and creates content on a variety of safety-related topics and contributes to several products, specializes in issues such as walking working surfaces, powered industrial trucks, and injury and illness record keeping. Again, we thank you all for tuning in this presentation. Mark, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Very good, Alan. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know we're all busy. So we're just going to lean right into this. I'm going to start out with a little information about J.J. Keller training. Our training solutions cover a broad range of topics and are available in a variety of formats: training on demand, DVD, streaming video, video books, and more to help you meet your needs. Backed by our regulatory experts and using the latest techniques and technology, our training solutions give your employees the proper instruction they need. So thank you for joining us today. So we're going to start out here with this slide. I'm going to talk about what we're going to cover. Falls, all right. So they have really been a leading cause of fatalities and injuries in the workplace. I don't care what industry you work in. So that's really why preventing falls is so important. How you go about that, though, that's the tough part. So we're going to cover that today. Ed and I are going to talk about a couple different things. You can see the categories on the slides. So really, in order to reduce the risk of falls, it's important you're aware of the situations that can pose fall hazards. Now, there are three main types of hazards. You can see the bullet points there: unsafe environment, unsafe equipment, and unsafe behavior. We're going to talk about those, and then we're going to cover the three best practices or strategies to prevent falls. And that would be the three bullets there: eliminate hazards, use passive methods. What would those be? That would be a guardrail, a cover, maybe a fall restraint system. And then we're going to talk about administrative controls. That would be the safety monitoring, maybe warning lines, maybe you're using designated areas. So keep in mind, if those aren't enough to prevent a fall, you must provide your employees with a personal fall arrest system. And not only that, of course, you have to train them how to use it and how to inspect it. So we'll cover how to do that too. And then finally, we're going to talk about at the end, if there is a fall, heaven forbid, we'll discuss having a plan to rescue the worker. All right. So moving on here, what are the differences in falls? What are the different types? And why we care about this is some are more severe than others. So if you think about falls on the same level, this person tripping in the kitchen here, resulting in her falling to the ground or to the floor, she tripped over that mat there. So it's a slip or it could be a trip. These types of things have a high frequency rate. They happen quite often, but typically the severity rate is low. Okay, it can be high, but typically it's lower than what I'm going to talk about next, which is a fall from an elevation. So certainly if you're falling from one level to another, let's say you're working on a mezzanine and you fall off of that and you fall to the ground below, this doesn't happen as often as a trip, but the severity rate is extremely high. So just a little information on that before I move on. So what happens when you fall from an elevation? The saying goes, it's not the fall, it's the impact. What I find it really interesting is free fall velocity at impact when falling 20 feet, 20 miles an hour you're moving. So you're going to hit the ground in less than a second. Now, if you're 4 feet above a lower level and you step off something, you're going to hit that lower level in 0.5 seconds. So really quick. And then if you fall 100 feet, it's going to take you 2.5 seconds, and that would be a terrifying 2.5 seconds. Now that we covered that basics, let's get into a little more information about fall hazards. Now, in the beginning, we said that to reduce the risk of falls, it's important to be aware of the situations that can pose fall hazards. We already mentioned this. We talked about unsafe environment, equipment, and behavior. We'll begin with the environment. All right, because a lot of times it's the environment that creates the fall hazard. Now you can see the image there. Somebody's walking up on a mezzanine, and there's the guardrail is not fully extended. It's missing there. So there's a chance you could fall off that edge to the surface below. There's other examples, of course, of an unsafe environment that can cause a fall. How about uneven surfaces in the walkway? Maybe we have some missing covers or grates. And then things like, we see this all the time, trip hazards. Maybe there's some extension cords or something else in the aisle that could cause a fall. So one thing that we really want to stress now, because it is kind of winter in some parts of the country, general industry and construction have to deal with snow, mist, rain, ice on an elevated surface could cause it to be slippery and, of course, cause you to fall off. All right, moving on to unsafe equipment. This means the equipment itself creates the hazard. You can see in the image here, we've got a personal fall arrest system. It's damaged. So they're putting a do not use sign on it. This is where you really, if you're using this type of equipment, you got to do some training, because sometimes workers, and I'm guilty of it too, you get kind of lax when it comes to inspecting equipment. But personal protective equipment is pretty important, otherwise you wouldn't be wearing it. But when it comes to fall protection equipment, it's very, very important. So we know that these fall protection harnesses, they can take a lot of abuse. They get thrown around, they're used in environments that can cause degradation, that type of thing. So that's why you really do have to inspect this harness before each use. Another example that I like to use, if you're working on a mezzanine and you discover that there's a broken guardrail, of course, that's not going to do you any good. It's not going to keep you from falling. Keep instructing your employees and reinforcing that they need to look for and report any fall protection devices like guardrails, warning lines, other equipment that's damaged. Maybe it just doesn't look right. The issue with this is because they work in that same area all the time, they might not notice it anymore. That's why when you're doing an inspection of all the areas in your facility, which is something that you should do, you make sure this inspection is done by a safety committee or some other group of employees that don't work in that area, because they're going to see when they come to the area that they're going to inspect, they're going to see things that the people working there every day do not see it. All right. And then finally, we'll talk about unsafe behavior. So you see in this image, the step ladder, it's not locked out like it should be. And the employee looks like she's starting to climb that. Step ladders and straight ladders, we use those all the time in facilities on construction sites. I've had people say, well, it's just a ladder. I mean, I don't really need to be trained on it or whatever. And well, yes, you do, because I've heard somebody say, well, I used that step ladder last week and it was fine. I'm not sure what happened to it since. When I used it this time, it just collapsed and I fell and injured myself. So here's another one. The fall protection harness, the leg straps aren't tight. And you can imagine if you suffered a fall with this, you could really get injured severely. This type of behavior is seen by employees, I think, that don't wear this all the time. Maybe, they're not issued one that they've sized to themselves, so that when they put these things on, they're not tight and they're not sure how to use it. So again, this is where effective training comes into play here. To determine if they're doing this right, you really have to watch them, make sure they put it on, tighten the straps properly. There's a D-ring that's in the back. That's what the lanyard attaches to. Make sure that's positioned properly between the shoulder blades. And then the leg straps are properly tightened, not too tight, but certainly not this loose. And again, training, we can't talk about this enough. You have to make sure each employee's been trained as necessary by what we call a competent person. All right. OSHA uses that word quite a bit. And that competent person must be qualified in the following areas. Very important that they know these things: how to recognize the fall hazards in the work area, how to minimize and eliminate those hazards, then how to correctly install, set up, operate, maintain, disassemble any fall protection and other equipment you use. And then depending on your location, your state, or the city that you're located in, there may be other unique requirements that you need to follow. So we mentioned qualified person. I'm just going to define that really quick here. OSHA says that is someone who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees. And this is the important part. And who has the authority to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. So they can recognize the hazards, but they have the ability to either stop work or do whatever it takes to eliminate those hazards. Now, retraining, we get a lot of questions on this. So when should retraining be done? There's certain regulations that require an evaluation, like the forklift reg, that's every 3 years. But generally, you want to do retraining when there's a couple things that occur. You can see the 3 bullets on the slide. So you change your environment somehow. You build an addition, and now all of a sudden there's some fall hazards there that weren't there before. You need to, of course, train on that. So this is where the safety professional has to get involved before that new addition is even planned, because they need to make sure that hazards are mitigated. And then after the addition is put on, you have to perform a hazard assessment, and you're going to look for things like fall hazards as well as other hazards. And then what about if you change your workplace systems or equipment? So you install some new equipment that requires your employees to get on top of it. And I think we've got an image or two later on Ed's going to talk about. They might have to do an inspection, or maybe they have to change a filter or something. So they're certainly going to need training on how to protect themselves, be it with permanent guardrails, or maybe they do have to wear a personal fall protection, a fall arrest harness, and then they're going to tie off with a lanyard to an approved anchor point. And then the last thing I want to mention is, what if, you hear, and I know safety professionals hear about this all the time, that somebody was doing something wrong, unsafe. Maybe they kind of forgot about how to do something properly, or they, their understanding wasn't quite there. So they definitely need to be retrained to do that. All right. So training continues to be one of the most challenging areas for safety professionals. JJ Keller, training on demand, will help you meet and exceed OSHA's training requirements. Beyond today's topic, JJ Keller Training delivers 24/7 access to hundreds of online courses and streaming video. Excuse me. So because JJ Keller Training is sponsoring today's event, we're offering a complimentary OSHA training mistakes white paper. When you request more information, now you can see this poll pop up on the slide. So please go ahead. That's really a good white paper. And I think you'll enjoy it. So we will move on. That poll will stay up. And I think Ed is going to speak next.
I sure am. Thank you, Mark. And let me add my thanks to everyone for joining us. And again, if you have questions, you can send them in at any time. If you came in a little late, maybe you didn't hear, but we will be saving time at the end of the event for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please use that Q&A box and send them in. We will get through as many of them as we can. All right, let me move on to some strategies on preventing falls. Mark mentioned this earlier. The ideal is, of course, to eliminate hazards, but that's not always possible. Sometimes you'll use a passive method, like a guardrail or a cover. We call that passive because it doesn't require the employee to do anything. It's just there. And then there might be things like administrative controls. And again, we've got the list here: safety monitors, warning lines. These may not actually stop someone from falling, but they're an administrative. It's not quite as effective, but it's an option for you. So let's talk about the hierarchy of controls. The basic idea, of course, is controlling the hazard at its source, and that's the best way to protect employees. If we can eliminate the hazard or substitute something that's less dangerous, that's the most effective, but it also tends to be most difficult to add to an existing process or environment. Now, if you're in the design or concept development stage, it's easier to build those controls right in. But for an existing process, making those changes to eliminate or substitute can be a little more challenging. Now, if the work environment can be physically changed to prevent exposure, that's an engineering control. Examples would be a built-in barrier, an isolated space. We're talking fall protection, but you've probably heard of using less hazardous chemicals, things like that. And again, these are independent of worker interactions. Now, the initial costs of engineering controls could be higher than administrative or even using PPE, but often the long-term operating costs are lower. And in some cases, over time, they can provide even a savings because you're not constantly following up with everyone. Passive controls don't normally require as much maintenance. And if employees can change the way that they do their jobs, that's a work practice control or administrative control. That would be things like inspecting equipment, maintaining good housekeeping, keeping up with maintenance schedules, making sure that a problem's not going to arise. Now, those administrative controls, they do require workers to actually do something. And that means you're probably going to have to train workers to understand warning signs, how to safely conduct an inspection, what to look for. Now, this reduces the time. Some things you can just reduce the time that someone's exposed to a hazard. These administrative controls seem like they're relatively inexpensive to create and implement, but over the long term, they can, I kind of hinted, they can be a little costly to sustain. They require constant input. And again, they might be a little less effective than other methods. All right, so your first step is to conduct a hazard assessment. Now that's an evaluation of the workplace to look for sources of hazards or potential hazards to your employees. There are some OSHA regulations that require a hazard assessment. One is 1910.132, paragraph D. 1910.132 is a PPE standard, and it says the employer must assess the workplace to determine if hazards are present or likely to be present that would require the use of personal protective equipment. Now, most types of hazard assessments, like a job hazard analysis or a comprehensive safety audit, they're not addressed in the regulation, but they are viewed as best practices, doing those self-audits. The OSHA standard here doesn't specify who must conduct or certify a PPE hazard assessment. So anyone with the necessary skills and experience to identify hazards and select appropriate PPE controls could do that function. But the employer could designate someone to do this or even bring in a third party to help with that. So once you've characterized the nature of the identified hazards, you start to look for control measures and prioritize them for control. So in general, you might take the following actions. First, you might find a new method of doing the job, like analyzing different ways of reaching heights in the safest way possible. You might change or modify the physical conditions that create the hazards. You might eliminate or reduce hazards by changing work procedures. You could potentially reduce the necessity of doing a job or the frequency that it must be performed. At least that reduces exposure time. And of course, you might have to provide personal protective equipment for your employees, which you do at no cost to them. Now, in most cases in general industry, where a worker would be exposed to a fall of 4 feet or more, hopefully you can put in guardrails, but that's not always possible. I mean, sometimes employees need to work on top of machines or other locations where people don't normally go. So here's an example. You can see in this image, the employer installed some fall arrest systems and workers are tied off. They're wearing harnesses. Probably not feasible to put a guardrail around the top of this machine. Another thing to think about is how they get up there. They might use a ladder, for example. So the procedure would be they put on the harness, then they climb the ladder. When they get to the top of the ladder, they hook a self-retracting lanyard into the D-ring, and then they finally step off onto the top of the machine. Now, we do sometimes get questions like, well, what if they're only up there for a couple of minutes? You know, OSHA's take is there's no safe amount of time that someone can be exposed to a fall hazard or can work in an elevated area without fall protection. So I have heard safety people complain that workers skipped using protection because they're like, well, it's just going to be a couple of minutes. But if there is a fall hazard, they do need to use fall protection. And again, if it's possible, maybe you can change or modify the physical conditions that create the hazard. An option might be to install a ladder and put up guardrails that meet the standard, if that's possible to put something around the machine. Or another option would be to move the equipment to that needs maintenance down closer to floor level or reach it with a step ladder. Now, eliminating a hazard still present can be done by changing work procedures. Not all falls occur from heights. And as Mark mentioned earlier, that there would be trip hazards that could be eliminated by having a procedure that requires extension cords and other tools be put back in their assigned place when you're done with them. It's just good housekeeping. And that can apply to anything else. In fact, OSHA's general industry standard for housekeeping is 1910.22. It's in the Walking Working, and it's one of the most cited regulations. Now, reducing the necessity of doing a job or the frequency that it must be done, that's an option. Reducing job frequency, it contributes to safety only because it limits exposure time. So, I mean, while the person's up there, they're still exposed. So you do want to make every effort to eliminate hazards and prevent accidents by physical or environmental changes. And of course, when you need to, you have to provide personal protective equipment for your employees. Again, especially for fall protection, it's at no cost to them. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Mark to talk about some more strategies.
Excellent. Thank you. And we are getting some questions, so please continue to send those in so we get a chance to look at them in advance so we can answer them at the end. We've got some good ones. All right. So let's move on to the second strategy for fall prevention and passive methods. These would be guardrails, covers, fall restraint systems, that type of thing. Now, this example is a passive method, a specifically designed floor mat, and this is for the restaurant industry. And these mats are available for all different types of industrial and manufacturing environments. So if you think this is going to work for you, and they're used quite often, definitely want to check them out. So here we see a guardrail system. And what is a guardrail system? Well, just what it looks like here, a physical barrier. It's used alongside an unprotected edge. Maybe you have an exposed area, edge, whatever, or other area of a working walking surface. Now that's what we're talking about here. And we want to prevent workers from falling to that lower level. Guardrails, though, now OSHA is very, very specific. They have to have a top rail and a mid rail. And the top rail has to be able to withstand 200 pounds of downward or outward force in the event somebody would fall against that guardrail or lean against it, whatever. And then there has to be a mid rail, and that has to be between the top edge, midway between the top edge and the surface below. And you can see this also has a toe board that may be necessary if things can get kicked and then fall to a lower level, maybe strike somebody. Here are things we see all the time in manufacturing facilities. It's a cover. So this can be secured, it can be removable, but it has to be strong enough to prevent workers from falling into or through a hole. So they put this cover over there. Now, this cover would be different than a cover that was in a manufacturing or a loading dock area where a forklift was going to be driven over it. So it just all depends on, what area it's going to be in. So this one looks like it's just in a general walkway. All covers should be regularly inspected to make sure they remain secure, intact, and they can withstand the forces that may be imposed upon them, because if this is a walkway cover and something heavy gets rolled over it, it could break it, and you have to, of course, replace that. Oops, excuse me. Travel restraint. Now, these are really interesting. It's exactly what you see here on the slide. So this eliminates the possibility of a worker going over the unprotected edge or the side. Basically, you design this, or it is designed for you to let that worker travel just far enough to reach that edge, but no further. So they physically, because they're wearing either a harness or a body belt, they can't go any further. So these typically are combinations of a body support, like I just mentioned, a harness or a body belt. This is one of the few places that OSHA allows a body belt to be used. They do not allow it to be used in any kind of a fall protection. So, and then we have the anchorage, we have that connector, and then we have a lanyard. So very important combination. So moving on here, we're going to talk about a ladder safety system. You see these all the time. They're very interesting in that they are designed to eliminate or to reduce the possibility of somebody falling off this fixed ladder because they can't. And it's made up of a carrier safety sleeve. The person has a body harness on, lanyard, and then they have the connector. So the way this works is, if the worker's climbing up this ladder and for some reason slips, that safety sleeve is going to lock onto that carrier, preventing the worker from falling any further. They may fall a little distance, but once that safety sleeve determines that there's a fall, they are locked into position. And they're going to stay there until they regain control of the climb, or if there was a medical emergency or something, they'll need to be rescued. So this has to be designed, and this is important if you're going to buy one of these, so that it does not require the person to continually hold, push, or pull any part of that system up and down. So That's the secret. It allows you to move up and down the fixed ladder with both hands for climbing, and it allows you to do work when you stop climbing because you're going to be supported. And then finally, before I turn it over to Ed, safety net systems. Now, this is a construction requirement. You can see the regulation there, 1926.502. These are horizontal, or sometimes they're semi-horizontal barriers. They typically use a netting system to stop workers when they fall before they make contact with a lower level, or maybe there's an obstruction. You use them at unprotected sides. You can use them on low slope or even flat roofs. You can use them around openings. You can see here, this depiction, it depends on how far below the working surface the net is installed. The further below, you can see it must extend further out. And then general industry, OSHA addresses safety nets at 1910-29C, and that simply points back to the construction standard. But remember, when you're going to use these safety nets, they have to be installed as close as possible under where the employees are working, but never more than 30 feet below the edge of that working surface. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ed.
All right, thank you, Mark. And let's move on. We're going to talk about that third strategy, which is the administrative controls, things like designated areas, warning lines, and safety monitors. So I want to start out with designated areas. Employers can use these as fall protection in some situations. Now, it's basically a warning line that marks an area where employees can work without using additional fall protection. These can be allowed on low slope or what are called flat roofs. It can't be used on mezzanines or any other area, only on certain low slope roofs. And employees do need training on how to set up the area. Now, these can be used for what OSHA calls temporary and infrequent work if you're at least 6 feet from the roof edge. So an example of temporary and infrequent work might be changing the filter on a roof-mounted AC unit. A designated area can also be used for work that is at least 15 feet from the edge. And at that distance, the work doesn't have to be temporary and infrequent. It could be a job that takes all day or several days. But again, those are the distances. If you're within 6 feet, you need fall protection. If you're 6 feet for temporary and frequent, you can use the designated area. And if you're at least 15 feet, even if you're going to be up there several days, you can use a designated area. Now, similar to that is the safety monitor in construction. OSHA does allow employers to use a safety monitor under 1926.501 and 1926.502. Now, the employer does have to designate a competent person to monitor the safety of other employees, and they have a number of requirements to follow. They have to be competent to recognize the fall hazards. They have to warn the employee when it appears the employee is unaware of a fall hazard or is doing something unsafe. They have to be on the same working surface and within visual sighting distance of the person being monitored. They have to be close enough to communicate verbally with the employee, and they cannot have any other responsibilities that would take the monitor's attention away from that monitoring duty. Again, this is only for construction. General industry doesn't have the monitors, but it is an option. And another thing is that they said, don't allow mechanical equipment to be used or stored in areas where safety monitoring systems are used. Next up is the personal protective equipment. We've talked a couple of times about providing adequate and effective PPE for employees. Now, when engineering, work practice, and administrative controls aren't feasible or don't quite do enough protection, you do have to provide PPE and ensure its use. Now, this is equipment worn for a variety of hazards. You're probably familiar with things like gloves, foot protection, hearing protection, hard hats. For fall protection, or really any type of PPE, it is the last line of defense against a hazard. Now, if an employer is unable to eliminate or protect against fall hazards through modifications to the work equipment, they are required to determine the most appropriate PPE that workers would need to use. And again, it's your last line of defense, especially for falls from elevated platforms. So we'll talk about the different types. There's personal fall arrest systems, travel restraint systems, and positioning devices. Now, personal fall arrest systems are used to stop an employee in a fall from an elevated area. They consist of a body harness, an anchor point, and a connector. Connections might be a lanyard, a deceleration device, a lifeline, or some combination. Now, these harnesses have a maximum weight capacity defined by the manufacturer, and that includes not only the person, but any tools or equipment they're carrying. So if there is a need to use a personal fall harness for someone who is outside the listed capacity, you probably need to contact the manufacturer, and you might need to get a custom harness based on weight it's designed to uphold. And it is important to note the requirements. Again, Mark mentioned body belts cannot be used as part of a personal fall arrest system. It's got to be the harness. Now, a positioning device is made up of equipment and connectors that here you could have a belt or it could be a harness. And the purpose of the positioning system is to let a worker be supported on an elevated or vertical surface. Think of a wall or even a windowsill. And it lets them work freely with both hands. And again, here a belt can be used. And I'm going to turn it back to Mark to talk a little bit about inspections.
All right, if I can get on the right slide here, I will. All right, Ed, thanks. And keep these questions coming in because we're getting some, but we like to have quite a few. So, all right. So let me get here. All right, now we know this, but any kind of PPE should really be inspected before each use, but especially fall protection equipment. And that is required by the general industry standard and the construction standards. And why do we care? Why do we want to inspect this? Well, it helps you identify and correct problems before they can cause any harm. Makes a lot of sense. Now, these inspections also have to be done whenever workplace conditions have changed since the last inspection, like when a body harness accidentally comes in contact with a chemical, or maybe it got exposed to excessive heat, that can definitely damage that. And with the fall protection harness, you don't want to take any chances. Also, if that fall protection equipment, the harness and lanyard, heaven forbid they're involved in a fall, they cannot be used again until inspected. And the odds of them being used after that are pretty slim, in my opinion. Now, OSHA doesn't incorporate this ANSI standard. It's ANSI ASSEZ 359.2. And in section 5.2, that specifically requires that fall protection equipment is inspected by a competent person at a minimum of every 12 months. And if the manufacturer requires it, it can be done more than that. Now, this is not incorporated by OSHA, as I mentioned, but it's a very good best practice because these types of equipment can get damaged pretty easily. The process in this inspection, they don't say how to do that, but of course it should be in writing. And by referencing this ANSI ASSE standard, section 5A1 of the general duty clause, you could get cited for that. Just because it's not incorporated doesn't mean OSHA won't cite you for it. Now, here's some things that you want to look for when you're doing your inspection. Look for any damage, deterioration, things just get worn out, parts can get broken or bent. Pay attention to anything that can affect that. Integrity. We got the list here. I'm not going to read it all off, but I mentioned, heat and chemical damage. That's a big one. You can see a lot of these things are pretty obvious. All right. So the person there on the slide image is doing a good job. They're literally looking at every inch of their harness. They're looking at the buckles, and that's exactly what you want to do, because before you put that thing on, you want to make sure it's going to do its job. Now, I knew a professional safety guy. He mentioned to me one time he got a brand new harness from the manufacturer. He took it out of the packaging and decided, hey, I should really take a look at this. And he inspected it, and he discovered there was a section that the stitching was coming loose. Okay, so it was defective. It came from the manufacturer. He wasn't too happy. He sent it back. So that's just kind of a reminder that, even new PPE, give it a quick look, because you just never know what you're going to get. Now, fall protection gear, this stuff is, I don't want to say delicate, but you have to handle it properly. This person has a area here that he's putting his fall protection harness in. It's called a designated storage area. This should be someplace that's off the beaten path. It should be dry, cool, protected from chemicals, and definitely not having a lot of sunlight beating down on that equipment, because that will deteriorate it. Same with hard hats. Also tell your employees if, they see any fall protection equipment that's, just laying around and like on the floor, on a cabinet somewhere, it's not stored properly, obviously. So they should get in contact with their safety person, or they should bring it somewhere, but it should definitely be inspected, because maybe somebody took it off and decided not to wear it because it wasn't right. So there, you should have a company policy on that things should be returned to your designated area. All right, maintenance. Maintenance is very important, just not only for fall protection equipment. So if you do find something wrong, report the damage, remove it from service, make sure it's not used again, put some kind of warning device on it. Now, if it's damaged beyond repair, which, like I said, if somebody falls in a harness and a lanyard, it's pretty much, in my opinion, done. You do need to destroy it. As mentioned earlier, impact loading, you can have the competent person inspect it, and they will, of course, make that final, declaration that, it's got to be destroyed, or, well, we can use it again. Leave it up to them to make that call. And then, as always, maintenance work on all other forms of fall protection. Perform that per the manufacturer's recommendations. I know, it seems like, oh, whatever, but there's specific requirements for doing maintenance work on some of the stuff. So especially if the repair involves the structural integrity of a working surface, the surface you're walking on, we're talking about here, that's got to be done or supervised by a qualified person. Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. I'm going to kind of wrap things up with talking about the construction requirement for developing a rescue plan. And frankly, if you have workers in general industry who are using a harness, it's a good idea also, because you want to promptly rescue employees. The construction requirements include establishing verbal contact within 6 minutes and rescue within 15 minutes. That's 15 minutes is the threshold expected for a healthy person to avoid certain complications like blood clots. If you've heard of suspension trauma, that can include blood clots in the legs. And frankly, that can form in even less time if employees have medical conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure. If clots form, it's probably not going to be obvious at the scene, so you do need medical attention. At a minimum, emergency medical service and EMS should be provided, but it's probably going to be a trip to the hospital as well. And in fact, once the person is down, you want to keep the torso and head elevated in case any clots break free. And again, you're going to be off to the hospital. There's also some argument between a full deploy of fall protection, like a rip stitches or a lanyard, versus just getting caught. Like if you step over an edge and a self-retracting lanyard catches you and you didn't actually really fall. Self-retracting lanyards, SRLs, are generally considered a superior in most situations, but you still may have someone who needs a fall rescue. So let's talk about that plan. There's going to be 3 components. First, who's going to do the rescue? You want to consider both your internal and external resources. After the fall, the workers on site should have a plan to get to and rescue the person, even while they're waiting for outside resources to respond. So brainstorm possible options here and help coordinate the response between the on-site workers and any responders who are coming to the scene. Size of the job site, they may not know where to go. Then consider, second, where the rescue may need to be done. And again, think about the fall hazards at the site, and that's going to depend on your tasks and your environment. And a survey or risk assessment can get you thinking about where you need to go. Certain equipment you might need would have to be run through there. We talked to one of our guys who was a safety manager. He said, you're running through a warehouse with a ladder to try and get up to somebody. It can get a little awkward at times. And another thing to think about, the third one, what equipment are we going to need? And again, that's going to depend on what fall arrest systems are used. So consider where the worker could end up after falling. Someone using a lanyard attached to an overhead anchor, we had some showed on top of a piece of equipment. They're going to fall straight down, but someone attached to a horizontal lifeline could end up further away from the fall location. It could be anywhere along that sliding line. Now, in some cases, self-rescue is an option, but most of the time it's not going to be feasible. And consider that the worker might be injured or even unconscious. So, your equipment could vary from a ladder to a scissor lift to get the person down. All right, now we talked about suspension trauma. There's a condition called orthostatic intolerance. And frankly, if you've ever stood up too quickly and felt lightheaded, you've had a light version of that. But over time, the pinching of the blood vessels, that can result in serious physical injury. And it could even cause death. And this can happen as little as 30 minutes or less. And that's suspension trauma. We want to avoid prolonged suspension. So OSHA recommends that you rescue suspended workers as quickly as possible. Be aware that they're at risk of this orthostatic intolerance. Be aware of the signs and symptoms of it. Again, feeling lightheaded, people might pass out. Be aware that it is potentially life-threatening, and especially for workers who have head injuries or were unconscious, they're particularly at risk. And consider any factors that could increase the risk of suspension trauma. And finally, your rescue plan should address procedures that look at the potential for suspension trauma. Your rescue procedures consider things like how the worker will be handled to avoid making any injuries worse. I mean, we don't want to make the patient worse. So consider things like, okay, if self-rescue is impossible or can't be performed immediately, you can train the worker to kind of pump the legs frequently to activate those muscles, and it helps stop the blood from pooling and get circulation going. If they are against a wall, they can use footholds to alleviate pressure as well and do that muscle pumping. Continuously monitoring the suspended worker for any signs or symptoms of intolerance or trauma, ensuring the worker receives trauma resuscitation once they're rescued. And again, if the worker is unconscious, keep their air passages open. First aid may be necessary, or even something more serious. And again, monitoring after rescue and getting evaluated by a healthcare professional. The worker should be hospitalized when appropriate, but at minimum get checked out by a healthcare professional. Remember that certain delayed effects, even things like kidney failure, could happen, but those possibilities are almost impossible to assess while on the scene. I'm going to turn it to Mark to wrap things up a bit.
All right, thanks, Ed. And keep the questions coming in. We're getting some really good ones here that we'll be able to answer. All right, today we talked about 3 main types of hazards. I mentioned unsafe environment, unsafe equipment, unsafe behavior. Then we talked about the 3 best practices or strategies, as you will, to prevent falls. We were going to eliminate the hazards. That's always number 1. And then we're going to use passive methods, guardrails, covers. And then administrative controls Ed talks about, and those are all very important. And then we talked about training workers on the use of personal fall arrest systems, how to inspect them, very important. And we covered having a plan. Ed did just a minute ago about how to rescue workers, and that is also very important. I'm going to turn it over to Ed.
All right, so we're about to move into our Q&A session. You still have time to send them in. And I want to once again mention the sponsor of today's webcast, which is J.J. Keller Training. Whatever your company's needs, J.J. Keller Training can help. And we have 24/7 access to hundreds of online courses, streaming video, and training across multiple industries. So if you missed the opportunity or you joined us late, we are offering a complimentary white paper on safety training basics when you request more information on J.J. Keller Training. So use the poll on your screen, and we'll be happy to send that out by the end of the week. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to our moderator to start going through your questions for us.
Well, thank you so much to you both for this presentation. And before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar. Your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. So our first question is, generally speaking, who is typically responsible for providing fall protection when a contractor's used, such as a window washer? Would it be the facility or the contracted agency?
So the company that's going to be responsible for providing fall protection is that individual's employer. They're the ones who are going to have to buy it and train them to do it. When you use contractors, you're probably not providing supervision on their work, but which makes some people, I wanted to take this one because it makes some people think, oh, well, it's the contractor's responsibility. That's true, but OSHA does have what they call a multi-employer citation policy. You can find it online. I forget the CPL number, the compliance directive number, but OSHA has an extensive multi-employer citation policy. And they define 4 categories of employers, like the exposing employer, the ones whose workers are exposed to the hazard. But they also have things like the correcting employer and the controlling employer. Now, the controlling employer can be someone who has the authority to make other people correct hazards. So if, for example, you're using a contractor and you see them doing something unsafe, you're aware of this and you have the authority to correct it, like telling the contractor, look, you need to get your people following OSHA regulations or you're off the job. If OSHA thinks that you could do that and you didn't, you could potentially be cited as the controlling or correcting employer. So that's a big deal. We've had a lot of questions about contractors like that lately. So even though the worker's employer is primarily responsible, do be aware that OSHA recognizes that another employer on the site, especially construction sites, your general contractor, might have the authority to require others to follow safety requirements. And if they don't, they could both be cited, both employers.
Our next question is for Mark. Do you have any charts that show the speed of your head during a fall, foot level fall versus a fall from elevation? A typical fall based on a 6-foot man or woman?
Sure. I don't have a chart, but in the beginning, I talked about this, how fast somebody's going to hit the lower level if they fell. And that would have pretty much applied to, everybody, at the same weight. Okay. So somebody 100 pounds versus 200 pounds is going to fall essentially at the same speed. So I mentioned that free fall velocity at impact when falling 12 feet, that's 20 miles an hour. And that's going to happen in less than a second. And a person falling 4 feet, they're going to hit that lower surface in a half a second. And then I mentioned the person falling 100 feet, 2.5 seconds to hit the ground. I'm sure there are charts out there, but this will give you kind of an idea how severe the fall could be.
This next question is for Ed. Actually, we get this question. I feel like we've gotten this question a couple of times over the years as well. Is there a guideline for how high an unprotected edge has to be to qualify for needing guardrails? For example, a ramp that rises to about 5 inches above the sidewalk.
OSHA actually only requires guardrails or other fall protection at 4 feet. And that's an interesting one. I'll get to the ramp in a moment, but we have seen things like, somebody said, well, we have a loading dock, but it's for a different type of truck and it's only 30 inches. So if the door is open, does it need fall protection? Well, technically no, by OSHA standard, but a fall from 30 inches, if someone pitches over head first, that's you could cause serious injury there. So technically it's 4 feet or more in general industry, but where you see them on ramps and things like that, it may be to avoid equipment running over, or if you're pushing a cart or something. So there isn't a requirement there, but for something like 5 inches, probably not. But what might be a good practice, and I don't think OSHA could cite you for it, but what might be a good practice is if you've got steps with more than 3 stairs risers, you're supposed to have a railing. Putting a railing on a ramp or something like that, if it's the same height, once you get above about 18 inches or so, wouldn't be a bad idea. It's not required unless it's, there's some way for people to trip off of there. But so the standard is actually 48 inches, 4 feet or more, but there can be situations, especially as you're going around corners, things like that, where the railings are helpful to direct people. And even check with your local building inspector to see if they have requirements, because local requirements might be very different than OSHA requirements.
This question is for Mark. And generally, what is the lifespan of safety nets and harnesses?
Well, That's going to depend on the environment that it's in. If it's out in, like a safety net, if it's been put in place for, a couple of weeks, I'm sure it's fine. If it's been there, you are required to inspect those, follow the manufacturer's recommendations, because they may have some real firm data. They're not going to sell stuff that doesn't stand up to the elements. And harnesses, sometimes they do put a date on them. Typically, that is if they're being used constantly from the data manufacturer. Now, if you wear a harness twice a year and it's your harness and you keep it somewhere safe and with no sunlight hitting it, and there is a date on there that says 5 years, it's probably going to last a lot longer than that. Now, how do you determine that? You're going to inspect it every single time. If the harness looks fine, then there's no reason to replace it. But if you're using it every day, and again, manufacturers always have some pretty good data on this.
This question is for Ed. Can you explain under what circumstances a flag line / stanchions are sufficient fall protection for low slope roofs? I've heard different things for 6 feet versus 15 feet from the edge, duration of work, etc.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that a little bit when you're talking about, first of all, the warning line. Warning lines are a little different in construction, and maybe I can push that to Mark there. But for general industry, you can find the requirements in 1910-28, 1910-29, and 1910-30. 30 has the training requirements. Basically, if you're within 6 feet of an edge, you have to wear conventional fall protection. If you're at least 6 feet from the edge and the work is temporary and infrequent, generally that means it's going to take no more than an hour or two, and it only comes up occasionally, like once a month. You can use those warning lines in a designated area as a type of fall protection. Again, you have to be at least 6 feet out, and for temporary and infrequent work. And then if you're at least 15 feet from the edge, you can use the warning line even if the work takes a lot longer, even if it's multiple days. So it depends on the distance, and OSHA has requirements for the height of the stanchions and the strength of the material, and on training on how to set it up properly and things like that. And even enforcing a rule telling people they're not allowed to go within 15 feet of the edge. So but yeah, you can find all of that in 1910, 28, 29, and 30. Just look for designated area, and it's pretty well spelled out. I don't know if Mark wants to cover anything for warning lines under construction.
I think we'll just go on to the next question.
Okay.
These things are pretty involved, and we want to get, you did a great job answering that. We want to get to some other questions.
So this question is for Mark. I thought if any part of the harness, lanyard, etc. is involved in a fall, the whole thing needs to be pulled from service for either discarding or proper repair by the manufacturer.
I agree completely. So it should be inspected. Okay. And Ed mentioned something before too, like if somebody fell and was caught by a self-retracting lifeline, that may not have damaged it in any way if they only fell just a couple feet. All in all, if I was a safety person and somebody fell in any kind of harness with a lanyard, I would pull the whole thing out of service. Do I want the liability to look at that and go, oh, this is fine, and then give it back to the person and have it not be fine? So in that case, a best practice would be to return it to the manufacturer, or if it's a rip stop or something, lanyard, and it's been deployed, that's no good. You can't use that again. So the same with the harness. When in doubt, 99.9% of the time, liability wise, I would not put that back in service.
Question is for Ed. What are the OSHA regulations for catwalks?
Oh, that's a good one. So catwalks are a little challenging to find because OSHA actually calls them runways. So if you're searching in the regulations, I was just looking in 1910-28, has a good bit on them. It talks about, obviously, if they're more than 4 feet above a lower level, you need a guardrail system. If there's some exceptions for that, OSHA says they need to be at least 18 inches wide, and you might need to do fall arrest systems depending on whether guardrails can or are not usable in some areas. But catwalks they're pretty straightforward. like I said, the challenge is if you're searching OSHA regs for them, OSHA calls them runways. They define them as catwalks in the beginning, the definition section, but throughout the regs, they don't use catwalks, they use runway. So if you look for that, you'll find a little bit more on them. And like I said, basically, if they're more than 4 feet, guardrails, if that's not possible, fall protection, and a minimum 18-inch width. That's the majority of what OSHA lists for them.
It's like we have time for one more question. I'll throw this one to Ed again. What about using local fire departments for rescue plans?
I think that could certainly be an option. Do check on their response times though, and what kind of equipment they're going to show up with. Because if you're going to call the fire department, are they going to be able to get equipment to the location where the person is suspended? If it's an indoor area, for example, we had people shown on top of a piece of equipment. It sounds great to have a fire truck with a ladder, but they're not going to get that in there. So do they have the training they would need to do the rescue, things like that? And what's their response time? Because if it's going to take them more than 15 minutes to get there, that's a long time for the person to be hanging. So certainly consider them, but see if they can provide appropriate response times.
Well, thank you so much to you both. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank our awesome presenters, Mark Stromey and Ed Zaleski, the entire team from our sponsor, JJ Keller, and of course, all of our listeners. Take care and have a safe day.